You want a room?" The landlord looked her up and down, slow and deliberate. The way a man inspects livestock, he's already decided to pass on. "Honey, I got a policy. Women your size tend to break the furniture." The men behind him laughed. Evelyn Harper set her bag down on the boardwalk. She looked at every face laughing at her. Then she picked her bag back up, turned around, and walked away. Not because she had somewhere to go, but because she refused to let them see her cry. She had 14 cents left, one name on a scrap of paper, and 22 miles of Montana dust between her and the last door she hadn't tried yet. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me because what happens at that ranch house door is going to change everything you think you know about worth, about want, and about what a woman discovers when the world has taken everything except her spine. The scrap of paper had been folded and unfolded so many times, the crease was wearing through. Evelyn smoothed it against her palm one more time as she stood at the edge of the main road out of Clearwater, reading the name she'd already memorized. Caleb Whitaker. She put it back in her pocket and started walking. She had learned about him from a laundress named Dora in Billings, a small, quick woman who pressed shirts with one hand and dispensed information with the other, as though both were services she offered freely. Dora's sister had worked a season on the Whitaker Ranch 2 years back. Big operation north of Clearwater. Cattle mostly. The owner paid fair wages, didn't tolerate cruelty toward his workers, and hadn't replaced a ranch hand without cause in 5 years. Men who stayed that long were men who were being treated right, and in Evelyn's experience that said more about a man's character than anything he'd ever say about himself. I was a widower. No children. Dora had mentioned that the way you mention weather offhand factual like it was just part of the landscape. Evelyn had filed it away and kept moving because keeping moving was what she did. It was the one thing she was better at than anything else. She had been walking away from things since she was 22. Walking away from the looks at church socials. Walking away from the men who took one glance and moved on to the woman next to her. Walking away from the cousins who promised a room in their house after her father died and delivered a broom closet and a list of chores that expanded daily, like they were testing how much she'd swallow before she stopped being useful. Walking away from the school teacher in Billings who stood at a church social in front of half the congregation and said he preferred a woman who carried herself with a little more grace, loud enough that she heard it loud enough that the women beside her pretended not to. She had walked away from all of it with her back straight and her jaw tight and her heart cracking quietly beneath her ribs where nobody could see it. This walk felt different. This walk felt like the last one she had in her. Her left boot had worn through at the heel 3 days ago. She'd padded it with folded newspaper, but the paper dissolved into sweat and road dust within the hour. And now every step sent a small, sharp reminder up through her ankle, you are running out of everything. Money. Options. Road. 14 cents in her leather purse. A change of dress. Her mother's Bible. A letter from her father's lawyer explaining in careful legal language that the farm was gone. The debts exceeded the assets and the bank had been more than patient. And the name on the paper. She turned north of the creek like the man at the feed store had told her, following the water until the cottonwoods thinned out and the fence line started. She was deep enough into her own thoughts that she almost missed the rider coming parallel along the other side of the fence until the horse snorted. She looked up. The man on horseback was watching her. The way you watch something that doesn't belong, not hostile exactly, but with the particular alertness of a person cataloging something unexpected. He was young, lean, with dust on his hat brim and the squint of someone who spent most of his life looking at distances. "You lost, ma'am," he called across the fence. "No," Evelyn said. "Is this the Whitaker property?" "It is." "Then I'm going exactly where I'm going. Thank you." The young man tilted his head like she'd said something in a language he almost recognized. Then he turned his horse and rode parallel to her for about 30 yards before peeling off toward the bunkhouse without another word. Good, she thought. Let them look. She'd been looked at her whole life. She was still standing. The gate with the white crossbar appeared where the feed store man said it would. and she walked through it and up the rutted track toward the main house. She passed the bunkhouse and heard the voices inside go quiet, that particular silence of men who have stopped talking because something has given them something else to think about. She kept her eyes forward. She climbed the 3 steps to the front porch. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. The door opened. Caleb Whitaker was taller than she'd built him in her mind from Dora's description. Broad through the shoulders, with a face that had spent 40 years in sun and wind, without ever particularly caring what either of them thought about it. Dark hair going silver at the temples. Eyes the gray-green of a Montana sky when the weather hadn't decided what it was going to do yet. He looked at her the way he probably looked at everything, completely without performance, as if the world owed him accurate information and he was willing to wait for it. He did not say hello. "You lost," he said. "No, sir." She stood straight. "My name is Evelyn Harper. I heard you run a fair operation, and I'm looking for honest work. I can cook, keep house, and manage accounts. I kept my father's farm books for 6 years. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I don't require much." He looked at her. Not rude, thorough. His eyes moved to her bag, her boots, her face. She had learned to hold still under that kind of looking. She'd had plenty of practice. "Where you coming from?" he said. "Billings. Before that, Hardin. My father's farm was outside Hardin. He passed this January." "You got family." "Not the useful kind." Something moved behind his eyes. Not amusement, something more careful, like a man who'd just heard a sentence he recognized. "I don't need more house staff," he said. "Woman comes in from town 3 days a week. That's sufficient. Is there other work on the property?" She did not move. "I'm not particular. I can learn what I don't know." He looked past her out toward the road as if checking for an explanation. As if a woman arriving alone at his door on foot in the late afternoon was a problem someone else had sent him, and he was waiting to understand the nature of it. Then he said, "I can give you a roof over your head." She waited. "But I'm going to be direct with you, Miss Harper." His voice didn't change. No apology in it, no hesitation. "I need a wife who can give me a son." The words landed like a stone dropped into standing water. Evelyn felt the ripple move through her anger, first hot and immediate, and then underneath it, something colder and older. The particular grief of a woman who has been measured and found useful, rather than wanted so many times, that she almost doesn't feel the insult anymore. Almost. She looked at him. She let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds. "A child," she said, "is not a payment for shelter." Caleb Whitaker blinked. She saw it, the small involuntary adjustment of a man who had expected a different answer. Women who arrived at his door with nothing didn't typically push back. Women who'd walked 22 miles with 14 cents in their purse didn't typically look at him like he'd said something that required correction. She stepped back off the porch. "I appreciate your honesty," she said. "I'll find work elsewhere." "Miss Harper." She stopped. She did not turn back immediately. She took 3 full seconds, long enough to breathe, not long enough to look like she needed them. Then she turned. Caleb was standing in the doorway with one hand on the frame. He looked like a man who'd just heard a floorboard crack under his foot and wasn't sure yet whether the floor was going to hold or not. "I said that wrong," he said. She waited. "I've been running this ranch alone for 7 years. He stopped. "I think in terms of what's missing and how to fill the gap. That's no way to speak to a person. I know that." It wasn't an apology exactly, but from a man like this, she suspected it was close to the most he knew how to give. "What I should have offered," he said, "is a room, fair wages, work with no conditions attached to either." She studied his face carefully. She had learned over the years to look at men when they were trying to fix something they'd broken, to see whether they were sorry for what they'd done, or only sorry it hadn't worked the way they intended. Caleb Whitaker's face was not easy to read, but she did not see calculation in it. She saw something closer to genuine discomfort. "What kind of work?" she said. "Household management. What I have isn't working. The woman from town does laundry and considers that sufficient. Cooking's been a joint effort between me and 3 ranch hands, which is about as good as it sounds. The accounts need a real set of eyes. He paused. You said you kept books. 6 years. My father was better with cattle than numbers. Most ranchers are. He stepped back from the doorway just enough to leave a space. I'll show you the room. You decide. Evelyn looked at the space he'd left. She looked back at the road. She thought about the landlord that morning, the men laughing behind him. She thought about 14 cents. I'll decide, she said, after I see the accounts. Something crossed his face, then quick, almost gone before it arrived. Not quite a smile. Something that lived in the same county. She walked through the door. The room was small, clean, east-facing window, narrow bed, washstand, hook on the wall. The cleanest room she'd been offered in 4 months. She made sure her face didn't say so. Wages, she said. He named a figure. More than the teaching position in Billings. More than the seamstress work in Hardin. I'll take the work, Evelyn said. She faced him fully. But I want to be clear about one thing. I am here because I choose to be. Not because I'm grateful for rescue. The moment this stops being fair, I leave. And I will not be made to feel that my being here is a favor you're doing me. Caleb looked at her for a moment. Understood, he said. Supper's at 6. He left. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, pressed her hands flat against her thighs, breathed. Then she got up, hung her spare dress on the hook, placed her mother's Bible on the windowsill, and went to find the kitchen. What she found was organized chaos, a larder full of supplies, arranged by no logic. She could identify a stove that needed cleaning pots stacked, so the one you needed was always on the bottom, and 6 pounds of dried beans pushed to the back of a shelf behind a rice sack, forgotten. She stood in the doorway for 60 seconds, taking inventory. Then she rolled up her sleeves. By 6 o'clock she had beef and vegetable stew on the table, cornbread in the pan, and coffee that meant business. She had also reorganized 2 shelves, located 3 items they were entirely out of, and started a supply list in her head. Caleb came in at 2 minutes past 6, washed his hands, sat down, looked at the food. He ate the entire bowl without speaking. Then, "This is better than what I've been eating." Not a compliment, a statement of fact. Evelyn had dealt with enough quiet men to know the difference, and to know that from a man like this, a statement of fact was as good as a standing ovation. "You're out of salt pork," she said. "Coffee supply's lower than you think. You have enough dried beans to feed your crew for a month if anyone cooked them. I can have a supply list ready tomorrow." He looked up from his bowl. "You work fast." "I've been working since I was 11, she said. "It becomes a habit." He was quiet. Then, "My wife used to say you could tell what a house really was by its kitchen. Not the parlor, the kitchen." Evelyn looked at him. It was the first personal thing he'd offered. She could see it had cost him something small, but real. "She sounds like she was a practical woman," Evelyn said. She was. He pushed back from the table, picked up his hat. "Thank you for the meal, Miss Harper. Good night, Mr. Whitaker." He went out. Evelyn cleared the table, washed the dishes, sat with a cup of coffee in the quiet kitchen. She thought about the porch, about the words he'd said and the ones he'd taken back, about the east-facing window and the decent wages, and the way he'd looked at her completely without performance, like she was a fact about the world that he was willing to account for. She was not foolish enough to think this was going to be simple, but she was still on her feet. Tomorrow, she would look at those accounts. The accounts were bad, in the way that things get bad when nobody's paying close enough attention. Not corrupt on their face, but sloppy in ways that left the door open for corruption. The ranch itself was sound, intelligent grazing rotation, solid buyer contracts and billings. A cattle operation that had clearly been built by someone who knew what he was doing. But the household side of things had been tracked on the backs of envelopes in 3 different handwriting styles. Supply invoices had never been matched to deliveries, and an entire summer's worth of receipts had been paper-clipped together and stuffed into the back of a desk drawer under a 3-year-old newspaper. Evelyn sat at the desk in the small office off the main room and worked through it for 4 hours straight. She made a list of questions. She made a second list of things that required Caleb's direct answer. She organized everything she couldn't resolve herself into its own pile and weighted it with a coffee cup so it couldn't be ignored. Then she went to find him, I was in the barn, working on a piece of harness leather that had given way, head down hands, moving with the practiced economy of a man who repaired things the same way he did everything else without wasted motion. He looked up when she came in without surprise, as if he'd somehow expected her. "I've been through the accounts," she said. He set the harness down. "And you have a recording problem, not a money problem. The money exists, but nobody's been keeping the books consistently, so you have no reliable picture of your actual position, which means you're making decisions from incomplete information." She held out the question list. "I need answers to these before I can fix it properly. Some of them you can answer right now." He took the list. "Read it." She watched his eyes track down the page and saw the exact moment he found the line that mattered. "This one," he said. He pointed. "Multiple payments to Collins Hardware, September through December. No corresponding delivery records." "What does that mean?" "It means someone was paying that account without the supplies being logged on this end. Either the supplies came in and weren't recorded, or they didn't come in at all." She paused. "Collins. Is that the Collins family in town?" His jaw tightened barely, but she caught it. "Margaret Collins runs the family business. Her husband died 3 years back. She and this ranch have a history. She has a particular interest in this property, business and otherwise. I'll need the original delivery logs." "I'll find them." She turned to go. "Miss Harper?" She stopped. "How long did it take you to find all this?" "4 hours." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "My lawyer has been telling me for 2 years the books were fine." "Your lawyer," Evelyn said, "is reading whatever someone chose to show him." She walked back to the house and started a new ledger from the first page. The first week settled into rhythm. Breakfast before 6. Pete, the wiry young ranch hand she'd seen on horseback. Her first day, came up from the bunkhouse each morning to carry food down to the crew. He said little, but noticed everything. She could tell by the way his eyes moved around the kitchen each time he came in, cataloging what had changed from the day before. By the third morning, he'd started showing up 5 minutes early and helping carry without being asked, which was the closest thing she'd had to a welcome. She kept working on the accounts in the mornings. She kept the kitchen and the garden in the afternoons. She dug out the abandoned beds behind the house and put in beans and herbs because the soil underneath was good, and good soil was something you didn't waste just because nobody had tended it recently. The ranch hands watched her. She knew they were watching. She heard the tone of the conversations from the bunkhouse when she passed, even when she couldn't make out the words. She had learned to navigate that kind of scrutiny the way you learn to walk on ice steadily, without sudden movements, without pretending the ice wasn't there. On the 8th day, it broke through the surface. She was at the kitchen counter working through a supply order when she heard the back door open without a knock. Heavy footfall. A man who expected the space to accommodate him. "Miss Harper." She turned. The man in the doorway was large and self-satisfied in the way that men who have never been seriously challenged often are. She'd seen him around the property she'd heard him called. He leaned against the doorframe like he owned it. "Boys have been talking," he said. "Figure a woman like yourself." He gestured at her, a slow, deliberate motion that was meant to indicate everything at once. "Doesn't really need to be up here in the main house. Bunkhouse cook is a respectable position." Evelyn set down her pencil. "A woman like myself," she said. Dill shrugged. "No offense meant." "None taken," she said pleasantly. "But I want you to consider something while you're here. I found a billing discrepancy this week in the supply accounts, $40 paid out with nothing to show for it on this end. I've flagged it, and I'll have it resolved by Friday. That $40, when it's recovered, is going winter feed. More cattle make it through to spring. More cattle means your wages get paid in full on time next season." She picked her pencil back up. "So you think carefully about what kind of woman belongs in which building, and whether the answer to that question is serving you the way you think it is." Dill opened his mouth, closed it, left. That evening, Caleb said without preface, "Dill gave you trouble today." "He did." "You handled it." "I did." He studied her across the table. "Word for word, how'd you handle it?" She told him. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The $40. You actually found it?" "Yes." "Where'd it go?" "That," she said, "is what I'm going to find out by Friday." He looked at her with that steady, storm-colored gaze. "You know what's interesting, Miss Harper?" "Tell me." "In 7 years, not one person who's worked on this property has ever walked into that barn and handed me a list of questions. They bring me problems, or they bring me excuses. You brought me a list of questions." Evelyn looked at him. "A list of questions is just a problem that's already been looked at." He nodded. Slow, like she'd confirmed something he'd been wondering. "My wife used to say the same thing," he said, and then quieter, like he hadn't entirely meant to say it out loud. Different words, same idea. Evelyn waited. She had learned that silence was the correct response when a taciturn man started speaking about something that cost him. "Clara," he said. The name came out careful, like something that had been kept in a closed room. "She died of fever, 4 years after we married. She—" He stopped. He picked up his fork, set it down. "She never got to see the ranch finished. She had ideas for it. Better ideas than mine, some of them." "What kind of ideas?" He looked up like the question surprised him. "Garden," he said after a moment. "She wanted a proper kitchen garden, said a ranch that couldn't feed itself from its own ground wasn't as sound as it looked on paper." Evelyn was very still. "I started putting in beds behind the house," she said quietly. "This week. The soil's good back there." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that she couldn't name. Not grief exactly, not gratitude, but something that lived between the two in the space where a man keeps things he doesn't know how to say. "I noticed," he said. "That was all." But the way he said it, the particular weight of 2 words from a man who chose words like a man, counts money carefully and only when necessary, told her it was more than he'd said about that garden to anyone in years. Margaret Collins arrived on a Tuesday in a buggy too clean for the roads she'd had to take to get here. Evelyn saw her from the kitchen window and had a full 30 seconds to form an impression, composed, deliberate, entirely certain of her welcome. Fine-boned mid-40s dressed in catalog clothing that took 6 weeks to arrive and was worth the wait for the effect it produced in a county where most women sewed their own. She knocked twice. When Evelyn opened the door, Margaret looked at her with an expression of polished surprise, so precisely calibrated that Evelyn understood immediately it had been prepared in advance. "I'm here to see Mr. Whitaker," Margaret said warmly. "Margaret Collins. I've been a friend to this ranch for a great many years." "Of course." Evelyn stepped back. "Come in, I'll let him know." Margaret stepped inside and cast a slow, appreciative look around the main room. "My goodness, it's tidier than I remember." "I've been organizing," Evelyn said. "How very thorough of you." The smile again. Perfect in every dimension except warmth. Caleb came in from outside, and Evelyn returned to the office and her ledger. The voices carried through the wall without her trying. "It's just such an unusual situation," she heard Margaret say. Her tone was the particular tone of a woman delivering concern she has packaged carefully as affection. "A woman alone living in your home. People in town are, well, you know how people talk, Caleb." "People in town," Caleb said, "can mind their own affairs." "Of course. I only raise it because I care about your reputation. And she's not quite what one might expect, is she, for a household manager? She's exactly what this household needed. She found 4 months of billing problems in her first week. If you have a specific concern about her competence, I'd be interested to hear it." A pause. Careful. "The supply accounts, actually. She apparently sent a letter of inquiry about some payments." "That's right. Those payments were legitimate, Caleb. You know I've always offered fair terms to this ranch." "I know the terms," Caleb said. "What I didn't know was that delivery records weren't being matched to invoices on this end. We'll be keeping better records going forward." Evelyn turned a page in her ledger and did not smile. Margaret left within the hour. On the way out, she paused in the office doorway. "Miss Harper," she said pleasantly. Evelyn looked up. "I do hope you've thought carefully about your position here." The smile was immaculate. A woman in your circumstances living in a widower's home tongues will wag regardless of how careful you are. And when they do, it's never the man who bears the cost of it. Evelyn set her pen down. Mrs. Collins, she said, I appreciate you making the trip to tell me that. Margaret's smile held. She left. Evelyn looked back at the ledger. She found the Collins hardware account. She traced every entry. She wrote a 3-line summary in the margin in her clearest hand, and then she turned the page and kept working, because the best answer to a woman who wanted to make her doubt herself was to simply keep doing the work until the work spoke for itself. 3 weeks in, Pete came up to the house one morning, and instead of waiting at the back door like he usually did, he knocked and then leaned in the doorframe with his hat in his hands, which meant he had something to say that he'd been building up to. The boys were wrong about you, he said. About at the start, when you first came. Evelyn kept stirring the oatmeal. I know. Dill's still. He stopped. Dill is Dill. But the others. They know you found that money in the books, and they know you put that garden in. He turned his hat brim in his hands. Old Mr. Whitaker, Caleb's father, I mean, he used to talk about how his wife had a garden back there. Caleb never. Nobody ever touched it after she died. Clara, I mean. After Clara died. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Thank you for telling me that, Pete. Yes, ma'am. He put his hat back on. Breakfast smells real good. Take an extra portion for yourself, she said. You've been coming up early. He looked at her surprised. Then he grinned, young and open like a boy who hadn't expected to be noticed. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. He left with the food. Evelyn turned back to the stove. That evening after supper, Caleb pushed back from the table and looked at her with that direct, unhurried way he had of looking like whatever he was about to say had been thought through and he wasn't going to soften it. Can I ask you something? He said. You can tell me it's not my business. Go ahead. Why hasn't someone married you? The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of wind working at the window frame. Evelyn looked at him. She thought about the men in Hardin, the cousins with the broom closet, the teacher at the social, the landlord that morning with his furniture joke. She thought about all the times she'd been looked at and found wanting. All the times she'd been looked at and found sufficient but inconvenient. All the times she'd packed her bag and walked away and told herself the walking was the point. Same reason nobody hired me, she said finally. Too much of some things, not enough of others, depending on who's doing the measuring. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then the people doing the measuring, he said, were working from the wrong scale. Evelyn went very still. Outside, the Montana evening was doing what Montana evenings did, coming in enormous and unhurried, turning the light copper and then blue, making everything underneath it feel both smaller and more important than it had seemed a few moments before. Good night, Mr. Whitaker, she said. Good night, Miss Harper. She went to her room, sat on the bed, pressed her hands flat against her thighs, and breathed. The east window was darkening. Outside she could hear cattle moving somewhere in the far field, and Pete and one of the other hands talking and laughing about something near the bunkhouse, easy and tired the way men sound at the end of a day's work. She had made it through another day. She was still on her feet, but for the first time since she'd come through that gate, standing on her feet didn't feel like the whole point. Something had shifted. She didn't know what to do with that yet, but she was going to have to figure it out, because in the morning she would go back to that ledger and back to the kitchen and back to the garden that had been someone else's dream before it started to feel like something she was building herself, and Caleb Whitaker would come in at 6 o'clock and wash his hands and sit down, and she was no longer certain what she saw when she looked at him. That was the most dangerous thing she'd felt in years, and she couldn't tell yet whether dangerous meant she should leave or stay. The morning after, Caleb said what he said about the measuring scale. Evelyn woke up before the sun and lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling for 20 minutes, which was 19 minutes longer than she usually allowed herself. Then she got up and made breakfast. That was what she did with things she didn't know how to hold. Yet, she put them down and picked up something she knew how to carry. The kitchen was reliable in a way that feelings were not. The stove either worked or it didn't. The beans either cooked through or they didn't. There was no ambiguity in cornbread. She needed that right now. Pete appeared at the back door at 10 to 6 earlier than usual, hat in hand. "Morning, Miss Harper." "Morning. Extra biscuits today. Take them all." He looked at the pan, like she'd offered him something sacred. "You sleep all right, ma'am?" "Fine." "Fine," she said. She had not slept at all. She sent Pete off with breakfast for the crew and stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched the sun come up over the eastern fence line, and told herself very firmly that Caleb Whitaker was her employer, that she was here because she needed work and he needed someone competent, and that a man who said something kind after supper did not constitute a change in the nature of their arrangement. She believed herself for about 3 minutes. Then Caleb came in from the barn, poured himself coffee without a word, sat down at the table and looked at her over the rim of the cup with those storm-colored eyes that saw everything and commented on nothing, and she understood with a quiet, uncomfortable clarity that she was in considerably more trouble than she'd planned for when she walked through that gate. "Supply list is on the desk," she said, because it was the most practical thing she could think of to say. "I'll take it to town today." He set his cup down. "You want to come?" She blinked. "To town?" "You haven't been off this property in 3 weeks, and I need someone who knows what's on that list to make sure I come back with the right things." He said it the way he said most things, like it was a logistical observation, not an invitation. "Up to you." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "Give me 10 minutes." She went to her room, changed into her better dress, and told herself the reason her hands were steady was because she was a practical woman. They rode into clear water in the ranch wagon, with the supply list between them on the seat and 3 weeks of unspoken things filling the space that the list didn't cover. Caleb drove the way he did everything, without wasted motion, without unnecessary commentary. The road was dry and the morning was cool, and Evelyn watched the fence lines go by and thought about Clara's garden and Pete's face when she noticed he'd been coming early, and she thought about the fact that 3 weeks ago she had arrived at this town with 14 cents and been laughed out of a boarding house, and now she was riding back into it beside the man who owned the largest ranch in the county. She was thinking about all of that when the first person recognized her. It was a woman in front of the dry goods store, late 40s, aproned, sharp-eyed in the way of someone who has appointed herself keeper of the community's accounting of who belongs where. "Mr. Whitaker," the woman said, her eyes sliding immediately to Evelyn. "Haven't seen you in town in a while." "Mrs. Hale," Caleb said. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the supply store and got down without elaborating. Mrs. Hale was still looking at Evelyn. The look was the kind that took inventory while pretending to simply look. "And you are?" "Evelyn Harper," Evelyn said pleasantly. "I manage the Whitaker household." "Is that right?" Not a question. An assessment. "Where are you from, Miss Harper?" "Hardin originally. Before that, wherever the work was." Mrs. Hale's eyes moved to her dress, her hands back to her face. The calculation behind them was so visible, it was almost admirable. "Well," Mrs. Hale said, "Clearwater is a small town. You'll find people here are very attentive to the way things are done." "I've noticed that," Evelyn said. "It's a quality I respect." She climbed down from the wagon and followed Caleb into the supply store, and she heard Mrs. Hale say something to the woman beside her in a voice just loud enough to be intended as carrying. "A woman like that living in his house. You'd think he'd have more sense." Evelyn kept walking. Her back was straight and her jaw was tight, and inside her ribs something small and old curled up and waited to see if this time it was going to break her. It was not. Inside the supply store, Caleb was already at the counter with the list. He handed it to the store owner without preamble, and then turned and looked at Evelyn with an expression she was learning to read, the slight tightening around his eyes that meant he'd heard something he didn't like and was deciding what to do about it. "Mrs. Hale," he said, quiet. "I know the type," Evelyn said, equally quiet. "Don't worry about it." "I'm not worried. I'm annoyed." "Then be annoyed quietly, and let me look at the seed catalog while you sort out the supply order." He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the counter. She found the seed catalog on a shelf near the window and stood there going through it with genuine focus, because the garden was real and required real decisions, and focusing on something real was how she'd survived every hard thing she'd ever walked through. She was deep into the kitchen herb section when she heard the door open behind her and felt without turning the particular quality of attention that enters a room with a person who has prepared for their entrance. "Why, Caleb?" Margaret Collins's voice was warm as a banked fire, comfortable on the surface, dangerous underneath. "I didn't expect to see you in town today." "Margaret." Caleb's voice was neutral. "And Miss Harper." A pause precisely long enough to be noticed. "How lovely. Getting settled in, I see." Evelyn turned. "Mrs. Collins, nice to see you." Margaret's smile was the same as always, perfect above the cheekbones, empty below the eyes. "I was just telling Mrs. Hale how industrious you've been out at the ranch. It's quite a thing, a woman taking on so much responsibility." She glanced at Caleb. "You always did need someone to manage things, Caleb. Clara was so good at that." The use of Clara's name was deliberate. Evelyn saw Caleb's jaw tighten by a fraction. "She was," he said. Flat. Of course, Clara had the benefit of actually belonging to this community. Margaret continued on, never shifting from warm. "She grew up here. Everyone knew her family. It made things simpler. For her. For you." She looked at Evelyn pleasantly. "I imagine it must be quite difficult arriving somewhere new without any of those connections." Evelyn looked at her. She thought about 14 cents. She thought about the laughing men at the boarding house. She thought about Clara's garden going to seed for years because nobody knew what to do with it. "It has its challenges," Evelyn said. "But I find that good work tends to introduce a person to a community more reliably than family connections do. The work speaks for itself." A beat of silence. "How practical," Margaret said. "I've always found it to be," Evelyn said. Caleb had turned from the counter and was watching them both with the expression of a man observing something he finds both uncomfortable and instructive. Margaret turned her attention back to him with the ease of a woman changing conversational currents. "I was hoping to speak with you about the hardware account, actually. I understand there have been some questions raised." "There have," Caleb said. "Miss Harper is working through it." "Yes, about that." Margaret took a small step that positioned her more squarely toward Caleb and very slightly away from Evelyn. It was done smoothly, naturally, the way a woman does something she's practiced. "I wonder if it might be simpler to discuss it directly, you and I, without involving," she paused, "additional parties." "Miss Harper isn't an additional party," Caleb said. "She's the one who found the discrepancy. She'll be part of any conversation about resolving it." Margaret's smile did not waver, but something behind it did. "Of course," she said warmly. "Whatever you think is best, Caleb." She left the store with the same composed precision she'd entered it, and Evelyn turned back to the seed catalog and spent a moment looking at a page she wasn't reading. "She's been trying to get access to those accounts for 2 years, Caleb said quietly beside her. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the supply order the store owner had placed on the counter. "Every time I let her manage a transaction, something came in slightly under what was ordered. Small enough that nobody noticed. Consistent enough to matter." Evelyn turned and looked at him. "How much?" "By my current estimate, something in the range of $240 over 18 months. "That's not small." "No." He picked up the supply order. "It's also not provable yet. Not without the delivery logs." "I'll have them by end of week," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "I know you will." They drove back to the ranch in a silence that was different from the silence of the drive and heavier, more aware of itself, full of things that had been named in the space between them without being said out loud. As they pulled through the gate, Caleb said, "Mrs. Hale will tell 6 people what she saw today." "I know," Evelyn said. "It'll get back to you in a version that isn't flattering." "It always does," Evelyn said. "I've stopped waiting for the flattering version." He pulled the wagon to a stop by the supply barn and sat for a moment with the reins loose in his hands. "I want to say something," he said. Evelyn waited. "What those women think about your being at this ranch." He stopped. Started again. "What the town thinks. It doesn't change what I think. I want to be clear about that." She looked at him. The afternoon sun was behind him, and she couldn't read his face as well as she wanted to. "What do you think?" she said. I was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. I think, he said, that you are the most capable person who has walked onto this property in 7 years. And I think the reason nobody married you is the same reason a good horse goes unbought at auction, because the people looking don't know what they're looking at. Evelyn's chest did something complicated. That's a very Western compliment, she said. It's the best kind I know how to give, he said. He got down from the wagon and went to unload supplies, and Evelyn sat there for exactly 4 seconds before she climbed down and went to help. Because that was what she did. She worked, and working was how she kept herself from feeling things before she was ready to feel them. But she was getting ready, whether she wanted to be or not. The trouble with the delivery logs came to a head on a Thursday. She had been working through them all week, cross-referencing against the Collins hardware invoices, and the pattern that emerged was precise enough to be intentional and subtle enough to have been invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it specifically. Supplies ordered in quantities sufficient to generate a particular invoice amount. Deliveries recorded as received in full. But the actual supply counts in the ranch inventory didn't match. Month after month. Small shortfalls in each individual item, a few pounds of nails here, a length of fencing wire there, that added up over 18 months to $263.40. Evelyn wrote the number at the bottom of her summary page in her clearest hand and underlined it twice. Then she heard shouting from outside. She went to the window. Dill was in the yard between the house and the bunkhouse, and he was talking at Pete with the particular volume of a man who has decided to make a point by making sure everyone nearby hears him making it. Doesn't belong here making decisions about how this ranch is run. She's not making decisions, Pete said. His voice was even but tight. She's doing her job. Her job! Dill said it the way you repeat a word you find absurd. You know what she actually is. She's a stray Whitaker let in off the road because he felt sorry for her. And now she's in his house and in his books, and if you can't see where that ends up, you're a fool. Evelyn stepped back from the window. She had 2 choices. She could stay inside and let Pete handle it and allow Dill to say whatever he wanted in that yard, and in doing so, confirm in the minds of every man watching that she was something that needed protecting or ignoring. Or she could walk out there. She walked out there. The yard went quiet when she appeared. Dill saw her coming, and his chin came up the reflex of a man who expects retreat and has prepared for advance. Miss Harper, he said. Dill, she said. She stopped a comfortable distance from him and looked at him directly. I heard what you said about me. Then you know where I stand. I do. And I want you to know where I stand. She kept her voice level, her hands still. I am not here because Mr. Whitaker felt sorry for me. I am here because I found $260 missing from this ranch's accounts, and I'm in the process of getting it back. That money pays part of your wages. So whether or not you like me, or like the way I look, or like the idea of a woman running the household books, you have a financial interest in me being right here exactly where I am. Dill stared at her. $260, he said slowly. 263 if you want the exact figure. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, she was aware of other ranch hands stopped and listening, some by the bunkhouse door, one leaning on the fence, watching to see what happened next. Who took it? Dill said. I'm not going to say that out loud in a yard, she said. When I have what I need to say, I'll say it to Mr. Whitaker, in private, and then it'll be his decision what happens. She paused. That's how it should work, don't you think? Dill looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Pete, then back at her. Yes, ma'am, he said, quiet like something deflating. Reckon it is. She went back into the house and sat down at the desk and pressed her hands flat on the desk surface and breathed through her nose for 20 seconds. Then she picked up her pen and kept working. That evening at supper, she put the completed summary on the table beside Caleb's bowl. He read it while he ate. She watched his face, what little of it he allowed to show. He read the bottom number and was still for a moment. Collins Hardware, he said. The delivery shortfalls are systematic, she said. Consistent pattern, consistent margin, never large enough in any single month to catch the eye. Someone on that end knew the records wouldn't be checked against physical inventory. Because nobody here was checking. Correct. He set the paper down. He picked up his coffee. He looked at her across the table with an expression she could not fully read. You found this in 2 weeks, he said. I wasn't the first person to look at those books, she said. But I may be the first one who wasn't being paid to miss things. The silence that followed that sentence had weight to it. What do you need to take this further? He said. A letter to the hardware supplier in Billings, the one your Collins account orders through. Comparing their dispatch records against what Collins invoiced you for. If the pattern holds at the source, it's documented fraud. Write the letter, he said. I'll sign it. I'll have it to you tomorrow morning. Good. He was quiet. Then, you went out to talk to Dill today. She looked up. Pete told me, he said. It needed handling. It did. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. You handled it better than I would have. You'd have fired him, she said. Yes. And then you'd have lost a decent worker over a conversation that just needed redirecting. She looked at him. Dill isn't mean. He's just scared of things he doesn't understand. Most people are. Caleb looked at her. Including you. Especially me, she said. The difference is, I've had a lot of practice not letting it stop me. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face, the same careful recognizing thing she'd been seeing since the first day, but closer now. Like a distance that had been narrowing. Evelyn, he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She went still. He seemed to realize it at the same moment she did. He looked at his coffee cup. Miss Harper, he corrected. You can call me Evelyn, she said quietly. If you want. He looked up. All right, Caleb, she said, trying it. He looked at her for a moment. Then something crossed his face that she had never seen there before. Open, unguarded like a window in a house that keeps its shutters closed, surprising you by being on the latch. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The letter for Billings, he said. First thing tomorrow. First thing, she agreed. She cleared the table and washed the dishes and stood at the kitchen window afterward, looking at nothing in particular. And she thought about the distance between the woman who had knocked on that front door 4 weeks ago with a worn leather bag and 14 cents, and the woman standing here now with a ledger full of evidence and a garden coming up, and a man in the next room who had just said her name. She thought about what Dora the laundress had said back in Billings. Dora, who'd mentioned the ranch the way she mentioned weather offhand and factual, as if it were just part of the landscape. She thought about how the things that change your life most completely almost never announce themselves. The letter went to Billings the following morning. The response came back in 8 days. Evelyn was in the office when Caleb brought it in, still sealed, and set it on the desk in front of her without a word. She opened it. She read it. She read it a second time to make sure she'd understood the first time. The dispatch records from the billing supplier showed every order placed through Collins Hardware in full. Quantities matched to the Collins Hardware invoices to Whitaker Ranch exactly, which meant the goods had been dispatched to Collins Hardware as invoiced, which meant the shortage hadn't happened at the supplier, which meant it had happened between Collins Hardware's receipt of goods and their delivery to the ranch, which meant Margaret Collins had known, had directed it, had been doing it for 18 months with the calm confidence of a woman who'd never expected anyone to look closely enough to find it. Evelyn set the letter down. She looked at Caleb. He had read it over her shoulder. His face was very still and very controlled, and she could see underneath the control something that looked like a man who has just had a suspicion confirmed that he had hoped would be wrong. She's been coming to this ranch for 6 years, he said quietly, since before Clara died. I know, Evelyn said. She told me after Clara passed that she was worried about me, that she wanted to make sure I didn't have to manage everything alone. He paused. I thought she meant it. Evelyn looked at him. She thought carefully about what to say next. She may have meant some of it, she said. People's motives are rarely all one thing. She stole from me. She did, while telling me she was looking out for me. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. The silence in the office was different from the silences she'd gotten used to. This one had edges. "What do I do with this?" he said. "You can take it to the county sheriff," she said. "With the letter and my documentation, it's enough to open a formal inquiry. Or—" She paused. "You can go to her directly. Tell her what you have. Give her the chance to make it right before it becomes a legal matter." "Which would you do?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "I'd go to her directly first. Not because she deserves the grace, but because a legal proceeding in a small county is going to be talked about by everyone for years. And you have to live here." He looked at her. "You'd protect her reputation to protect mine." "I'd protect your peace," she said. "That's different." Caleb looked at her for a long time with that unreadable expression that she was slowly learning to read. "Come with me," he said. "To see Margaret." "Yes." "That might make it worse," Evelyn said. She's not well disposed toward me." "I know," Caleb said. "Come anyway." They went the following afternoon. Margaret's house was in town, a well-kept property that spoke of money managed carefully over a long time. She received them in the front parlor with every surface of her composure intact, and a cup of tea offered before Caleb had finished sitting down, and Evelyn sat to one side and let Caleb put the letter on the table between them. Margaret looked at it. She did not touch it. She looked at Evelyn. Then she looked at Caleb. "I see," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "I'd like the money returned," Caleb said. "All of it. And I'd like it done without involving the sheriff's office if that's possible. And if it isn't possible, then I'll involve the sheriff's office." A silence stretched out between them that Evelyn did not fill because it was not her silence to fill. Margaret looked at Caleb for a long moment with an expression that was for the first time entirely unperformed. "I needed capital," she said. "After William died, the business was in worse shape than anyone knew. I thought I could—" She stopped. "I intended to pay it back." "But you didn't," Caleb said. "No." She looked at her hands. "No, I didn't." "The money, Margaret. All of it. Within 30 days. She nodded. "Once." The motion cost her everything she'd walked in with. They drove back to the ranch in a silence that felt to Evelyn like the aftermath of a storm. The air different. The ground rearranged, everything still standing, but nothing quite where it had been. "That took courage," she said after a while. "What did Caleb said?" "Not taking it to the sheriff. That would have been easier in some ways." "It would have been crueler," he said. She looked at him. "Yes, it would have." He kept his eyes on the road. "Clara used to say that cruelty was the laziest choice, that it was always the first thing available and rarely the right one. She was right. She usually was." He paused. "I used to argue with her anyway. I think I thought it proved something." "What did it prove?" I was quiet for a moment. "That I wasn't as certain as I wanted her to think I was." He turned the wagon through the gate. "She always knew that. She just let me work it out in my own time." Evelyn looked at him. The man who had opened his door to her 4 weeks ago and offered her a roof in exchange for a son. The man who had said that wrong and then said something else and had kept saying something else every day since building a language between them that neither of them had expected to learn. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Evelyn said. "She was," he said. "I thought for a long time that remarkable was a thing you only got once." He pulled the wagon to a stop. He didn't move to get down. Neither did she. "And now," she said quietly. He turned and looked at her. Full on direct, the way he looked at things he was certain about. "Now," he said, "I'm not so sure about that." Evelyn held very still. The ranch was quiet around them, cattle distant, the bunkhouse smoke trailing up in the cooling air. Pete somewhere, singing something tuneless near the barn. The whole enormous Montana sky doing what it always did, going about its business of being infinite without asking anyone's opinion. She thought about the woman who had knocked on his door with 14 cents and a worn leather bag and nothing left to lose. She thought about who she was now. 4 weeks later, sitting beside a man who had just told her in his particular roundabout, irrevocable way that he was starting to see her. Not the shape of her. Not the use of her. Her. Caleb, she said. Evelyn, he said. And neither of them said anything else because neither of them needed to. Not yet. Not tonight. Not with everything still unresolved and uncertain and alive with the particular terror of something that is just beginning to be possible. She got down from the wagon. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen with her hands braced against the counter and her heart doing something she hadn't let it do in years. She was not safe. She was not certain. She was not sure of anything except that somewhere between the delivery logs and the Collins hardware account and a conversation in a wagon under a Montana sky, she had stopped trying to figure out whether she should leave. And she did not know yet whether that was the bravest thing she'd ever done or the most dangerous. The money came back. Not all at once. Margaret Collins was too proud for that and too careful. It arrived in 3 installments over the following month, each delivered by her bookkeeper to the ranch in a sealed envelope with no note inside. Just the cash counted exact, rubber-banded tight, like she wanted to make sure there was nothing personal in it. Like it was a transaction and not a confession. Caleb handed each envelope to Evelyn without comment. She counted it, recorded it in the ledger, and filed the envelopes in the back of the accounts drawer in case they were ever needed. On the day the final installment arrived, and the total reached $263.40, exactly. Pete came in with the envelope, and Evelyn counted it at the kitchen table, and wrote the last entry in the ledger, and closed the book, and sat there for a moment with her hand on the cover. "That's it," Pete said. He'd been watching from the doorway. "That's it." He let out a long breath. "You know what the boys are calling you?" She looked up. "The woman who got the money back," he said. He grinned. "Dill came up with it. Which I thought was, considering." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed, a real one, the kind that surprised her on the way out. "That's the finest title I've ever been given." "Yes, ma'am?" Pete was still grinning. "Breakfast was real good this morning, by the way." "You say that every morning, Pete." "Because it's true every morning, ma'am." She shook her head, and he went back out, and she sat alone with the closed ledger and the quiet kitchen, and let herself feel just for a moment the particular satisfaction of a thing finished well. Then she heard the wagon coming up the track, and looked out the window and saw Caleb returning from town, and the satisfaction shifted into something less settled and more alive. And she got up and put the kettle on, because that was what she did when she needed to do something with her hands. He came in and hung his hat and washed up and said, "Final installment came. Yes, we're square." He nodded. He sat down at the table. He looked at her with those steady eyes, and she could see something in his face that hadn't been there 2 months ago. Or maybe it had been there, and she hadn't known how to read it yet. Something open. Something that hadn't decided to close. "I ran into Judge Harmon in town," he said. She set 2 cups on the table and sat across from him. "And he asked me when I was planning to come to the next county social." He paused. "He also asked if I'd be bringing my household manager." She looked at him. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd ask her." The kitchen was very quiet. "When is it?" she said. 3 weeks Saturday." "I'll think about it," she said. "That's more than I expected," he said. And he almost smiled, that almost smile she'd learned to recognize, the one that lived in the corner of his mouth and never quite committed, like a man who'd forgotten the full motion of the thing and was relearning it slowly. She wrapped her hands around her cup and thought about walking into a county social on Caleb Whitaker's arm, and what every woman in that room would think and say and do about it. Then she thought about what she'd already survived to get to this table. "All right," she said. "I'll go." He looked at her. "You're sure?" "No," she said honestly. "But I've done harder things uncertain." That almost smile again, closer this time. "Yes," he said quietly. "You have." The 3 weeks between that conversation and the county social were the strangest 3 weeks of Evelyn's life. Strange not because anything went wrong, nothing went wrong. Strange because everything kept going right in ways she hadn't prepared herself to want. The garden came in. Not fully. It was too early in the season for the beans, but the herbs were up, and the beds were taking shape, and Pete had started watering them without being asked, which she chose not to mention to him because she knew he'd be embarrassed. Caleb had built a proper frame for the climbing beans. One afternoon, appearing with lumber and a plan, and no commentary, and they'd worked on it together in a silence that was entirely comfortable and entirely full at the same time. She was spending more time thinking about permanence. That frightened her more than anything Margaret Collins had ever said. She had built her whole adult life around the ability to leave. Knowing she could go was how she got through things she couldn't change. It was armor worn so long she'd forgotten it was there. But something was happening out here in this house, at this table in the garden, that had been someone else's dream and was quietly becoming hers. Something was getting through the armor. She didn't talk about it. She didn't know how. Instead, she sewed a better dress for the social, from fabric she found in a trunk in the spare room, navy blue simple, with buttons down the front that she replaced because the old ones were wrong. She told herself it was practical. She told herself it was just a county social, and it didn't mean anything. She told herself a lot of things that month. She believed fewer and fewer of them. On the morning of the social, Dill appeared at the kitchen door while she was cleaning up from breakfast, which was notable in itself because Dill had not voluntarily appeared at the kitchen door since the confrontation in the yard. He had his hat in his hands and his jaw set in the way of a man who has made a decision and is committed to carrying it out, regardless of how uncomfortable it gets. "Miss Harper," he said. "Dill," she said. "I want to say something." "Go ahead." He looked at the hat brim in his hands. "I was wrong about you. When you first came. I said things that weren't fair, and I—" He stopped, looked up. "I don't apologize easy, but I'm doing it now. What you did with the accounts. What you did for this ranch. That's—" He shook his head. "I was wrong." Evelyn looked at him. This big, self-certain man, who had made her first weeks harder than they needed to be, standing in her kitchen doorway, working his hat brim and looking like the apology was costing him actual money. "I know you were," she said. "Thank you for saying so." He nodded once. He put his hat back on. He left. She stood at the kitchen counter for a moment after he'd gone, and she thought about what it took for a man like that to come to a door like this and say those words. It wasn't nothing. In fact, in its way, it was everything. The county social was held in the Clearwater Meeting Hall, which Evelyn had never been inside. It was loud and bright and full of people who stopped talking when Caleb Whitaker walked in, which they did every time, apparently. She had dealt with rooms like this before. She squared her shoulders and smiled at the first person who looked at her directly and said good evening in a voice that gave nothing away. Mrs. Hale was there naturally. 3 other women whose names Evelyn didn't yet know, but whose expressions she recognized. Judge Harmon, who was younger than she'd pictured, and warmer, who shook her hand and said he'd heard good things about the Whitaker accounts. "From whom?" she said. "From Caleb," he said like it was obvious. She glanced at Caleb. He was talking to a rancher nearby and not looking at her, but she had the feeling he'd heard every word. The evening moved in the way of community events, music, food on long tables, children running between adult legs, the particular rolling noise of 50 conversations happening simultaneously. Evelyn talked to the judge's wife, who was originally from Ohio and had opinions about Montana winters that Evelyn found both accurate and hilarious. She talked to a young woman named Ruth, who'd been teaching school in Clearwater for 2 years, and who shook her hand like she meant it and said, "I heard what you found in those accounts. Half this town has done business with Collins Hardware." "I know," Evelyn said. "Are you staying?" Ruth said. "At the ranch, I mean. Long term." Evelyn paused. "I haven't decided," she said. Ruth looked at her with the clear eyes of a woman who sees things she doesn't always say. "Well," she said, "I hope you do." It was Margaret Collins arriving an hour into the evening that changed the temperature of the room. She came in, composed and immaculate, because Margaret Collins was never anything other than composed and immaculate. And the people nearest the door stepped back slightly, in the unconscious way of people who know something happened and are waiting to see what happens next. She moved through the room, exchanging greetings with the smooth efficiency of a woman who has been managing social situations for 20 years. And then she found Evelyn found her deliberately directly without pretending not to see her. "Miss Harper," she said. "Mrs. Collins," Evelyn said. The people nearby weren't pretending not to listen. "I want to say something to you," Margaret said. Her voice was even. Not warm, not cold, careful, like each word had been weighed. "What happened with the accounts was wrong. What I did was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I was doing it, and I did it anyway, which makes it worse." She paused. "I am not going to pretend I like you, Miss Harper. I don't particularly. But I want you to know that what I did had nothing to do with you. You were simply the one who found it." Evelyn looked at her. She thought about what this cost, this precise minimum exact admission from a woman like Margaret Collins, in a room full of people who were listening. "Thank you for saying so," Evelyn said. "I also want to say—" Margaret stopped. Something moved in her face that wasn't composure. "Caleb is a good man. He deserved better than what I gave him." She looked at Evelyn with something that was almost honest. "So did Clara. I told myself I was looking out for him after she died. I think I was looking out for myself. Those are different things." The silence between them was the size of everything that had happened since Evelyn knocked on that front door. "They are," Evelyn said quietly. "But knowing the difference is worth something." Margaret looked at her for a moment longer. Then she nodded once and moved away into the rest of the room, and Evelyn stood where she was and breathed very carefully through her nose. Caleb appeared at her elbow. "I heard that," he said quietly. "I figured you would," she said. "You could have said more." "I said what needed saying," she said. "The rest wasn't worth the cost." Howe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dance with me." She turned to look at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the small group of musicians setting up in the corner. But his arm was out, offered, waiting. She took it. They were not the best dancers in the room. Caleb moved like a man who learned to dance because it was required, rather than because he wanted to, with a careful, methodical attention to the steps that was endearing in exactly the way that careful, methodical men are endearing when they do something they're not completely sure of. Evelyn matched him. She had always been a better partner than a solo dancer. "You're counting," she said. "I'm not counting," he said. "You're absolutely counting. I am doing no such thing." A pause. 3, 4, 1. He stopped. "Don't tell Pete." She laughed. A 1, warm and unguarded, and she felt him relax slightly under her hand on his shoulder, as though her laughing had given him permission to breathe. They danced 2 songs. By the second one he'd stopped counting. On the way home, the wagon moving through the dark under a sky full of stars, too numerous to count, Caleb said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. "What would it take," he said carefully, "for you to stop thinking of this as temporary?" Evelyn was quiet. The horses moved. The dark moved around them. Montana at night was not quiet. There were insects and owls, and the distant sound of water over rocks somewhere to the east. But it had a quality of stillness underneath all of it that made words feel more serious. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've been temporary my whole life. I don't entirely know what permanent feels like." "What would it need to feel like?" he said. She thought about it. She thought about it the way she thought about the accounts carefully, without rushing to a number she hadn't verified. "Like something I chose," she said finally. "Not something I stayed in because I ran out of road." He nodded. She could see the motion of it in her peripheral vision. "Then I want you to choose it," he said. "Whatever that takes. I want it to be a choice you make, not a wall you run into." He paused. "I'm telling you that because I think you deserve to hear it plainly. Not hinted at. Plain." Evelyn stared straight ahead at the road and felt the armor she'd been wearing for 10 years do something it had never done before. It cracked. Not all the way. Not enough to see through. But she felt it a hairline fracture, small and cold and real in the part of herself she'd been protecting since she was 22 years old. "Caleb," she said. "Evelyn. Give me time." "I've got time," he said. "This ranch isn't going anywhere." She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was full of everything they'd both just said, and Evelyn sat with the crack in her armor and the stars overhead, and thought that she had never, not once in her life, been asked so cleanly and so plainly for the choice itself. Not for compliance, not for gratitude. The choice. She was still thinking about it when she went to bed. She was still thinking about it 3 days later when the letter arrived. It came on a Wednesday in a cream-colored envelope with a law firm's address embossed in the upper left corner, and Caleb's name written on the front, in the formal, deliberate hand of a man who charges by the word. Evelyn was in the office when Caleb brought it in. He read it standing up, which told her something. Men like Caleb sat down to read things they expected. They stood to read things that surprised them. She waited. He set the letter on the desk. "It's from my father's estate attorney," he said. "In Helena." She waited. "My father had a brother. Distant, we weren't close. He died last spring, and his family has been working through the estate ever since." He paused. "There's a clause. In my father's original land deed. If I die without a direct heir, the eastern section of the ranch, 400 acres, the best grazing land on the property, passes to the next male in the family line, which would be my cousin's son, a man I've met twice." Evelyn was very still. "How long have you known about this clause?" she said. "I knew the clause existed," he said. "I didn't know it had been activated by my cousin's death until now. His son is 23 years old and has never set foot on a working ranch. But he has a lawyer in Helena who apparently knows what 400 acres of Montana grazing land is worth." He looked at her. "The attorney is advising me that if I don't have a legitimate heir within—" He stopped. Looked at the letter. "Within 2 years the eastern section reverts." The silence was very loud. Evelyn heard it the way you hear something coming from a long distance, the low particular rumble of something that has always been out there and has finally gotten close enough to feel. He had said it to her once before. On a porch. On the first day. "I need a wife who can give me a son." She stood up. "I need to think," she said. "Evelyn." "I'm not leaving," she said quickly. "I'm not packing anything. I need an hour." She went out through the kitchen door and walked to the garden. She stood between the bean rows with her arms crossed over her chest and stared at the fence line and breathed and thought. The question wasn't whether Caleb cared about her. She knew he had known it in a slow, accumulating way for weeks, evidence building like entries in a ledger until the total was undeniable. The question was whether she could trust that the caring was separate from the need. Whether what he felt for her existed independently of what she could give him. Whether she was wanted, or just useful. She had been useful her whole life. She was very, very tired of useful. She heard boots on the path behind her and turned. Caleb stopped at the edge of the garden. He had his hat in his hands. He always took his hat off when something mattered. She'd noticed that, and he looked at her with an expression that was stripped of everything he usually kept in place. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "Do you?" "You're thinking it's the porch again," he said. "You're thinking I'm about to tell you that you're a solution to a problem." She looked at him. "I'm not," he said. "I want to be clear about that. The letter doesn't change what I feel. It changes what I'm afraid of losing. Those are two different things, and I know it." He took a step toward the garden edge. "I'm afraid of losing that land because my father built it, and it's part of what this ranch is. But I'd rather lose the land than—" He stopped. "I'd rather lose all 400 acres than go back to the man I was before you walked through that gate." Evelyn's chest did the thing. It had been doing more and more frequently, that complicated, terrifying, entirely unwelcome thing that felt like waking up. "That's a considerable thing to say," she said. "It's a considerable thing to mean," he said. "But I mean it." "Caleb." She looked at him directly. "If I could never give you a child, if that was simply not possible, would you still want me here?" He did not hesitate. "Yes," he said. One word. Flat, certain, undecorated. The way he said everything he was sure about. She believed him. And she understood standing in Clara's garden with the beans coming up around her, and the Montana sky doing its enormous, indifferent thing overhead. That belief was the thing she'd been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting for it. Not romance, not rescue. Not a man who told her she was beautiful, or that the world had been wrong about her. Belief. She had believed him. For the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, she believed someone. She uncrossed her arms. "All right," she said. "All right what?" he said carefully. "All right," she said. "I choose it." He looked at her for a moment, like a man who has been bracing for something and suddenly has nothing to brace against. "You're sure," he said. "I told you on the first day," she said. "I don't do things because I've run out of road. I do them because I choose them." She held his gaze. "I'm choosing this." He crossed the garden edge and walked toward her and stopped when he was close enough that she could see the expression on his face, clearly open, unguarded the window on the latch, and he reached out and took her hand in both of his. "Is the way you hold something you've been looking for a long time, and have just been handed and are not entirely sure yet you're allowed to keep. Then I'll spend every day making sure you don't regret it," he said. "Don't promise me that," she said. "Promise me you'll be honest when things are hard. That's worth more." He looked at her. He turned her hand over in his. "I promise," he said. She believed that too. What happened next happened fast. The way the things you've been putting off always happen when they finally start moving. Caleb went to Helena himself, which surprised her. She had expected him to write letters to work through lawyers the way men of property worked through lawyers. Instead, he rode to the train station and was gone for 3 days, and came back with a meeting scheduled with the estate attorney and a plan for contesting the clause's application, based on a legal argument. His own lawyer had found that the clause specified direct heir without specifying legitimate, which opened a different set of options than the cousin's lawyer had anticipated. "You went yourself," she said when he told her. "It was my land," he said, "and it needed a person, not a letter." She looked at him and thought about the man she'd first seen in that doorway, the one who'd offered a woman shelter in exchange for a son who'd been thinking in terms of gaps to fill and problems to solve. That man was still in there somewhere, but he'd been changed by something. By her, maybe. By himself deciding to change. She wasn't sure which, and she was beginning to think it didn't matter. But the day he came back from Helena was also the day Margaret Collins came back. Not to the ranch. To the social circuit of Clearwater, which amounted to the same thing, because what happened in Clearwater's social circuit was in Caleb Whitaker's kitchen by the end of the week, whether he invited it or not. Ruth, the schoolteacher, brought it herself, arriving on a Friday afternoon with a basket of preserves and the expression of a woman delivering news she hasn't decided whether is good or bad. "People are talking," she said, sitting across from Evelyn at the kitchen table, with her hands around a cup of tea. "People always are," Evelyn said. "This is more specific." Ruth looked at her directly. It was what Evelyn liked best about her. "Margaret Collins has been telling people that the reason she returned the money was because you threatened her. That you found the discrepancy and used it to coerce her into paying, rather than taking it to the sheriff, which she claims was your leverage over her." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "She's saying I blackmailed her," she said. "In so many words." "Yes." Evelyn set her cup down. She thought about the parlor, the letter on the table, Caleb's voice saying simply, "I'd like the money returned." She thought about her own words, "You can take it to the county sheriff, or you can go to her directly." She thought about how she had been the one to suggest the gentler path. "Does she know," Evelyn said carefully, "that the choice to go to her directly, rather than the sheriff, was mine? That I suggested it specifically to protect her reputation?" Ruth looked at her. "Does Caleb know that?" "Yes." "Then that's what matters," Ruth said. "But Evelyn, the story is moving. People who want to believe it will believe it regardless of the facts. And there are people in this town who want to believe it." Evelyn knew who those people were. She didn't need the list spelled out. "What would you do?" she said. Ruth considered. "I'd let Caleb know exactly what's being said, and I'd let the people who matter see you clearly and make their own judgment." She paused. "You've been making people see you clearly since you got here. Don't stop now." She left the preserves and went back to town, and Evelyn sat alone in the kitchen for a moment and felt something that was not quite fear and not quite anger. Something between the two. The particular feeling of a woman who has worked very hard to build something and can see someone trying to tear it down. She told Caleb that night. She laid it out plainly the way she laid out accounts what had been said, who had said it, what the likely spread of it was going to be. He listened without interrupting. That was one of the things she'd come to depend on in him. He listened the way he looked completely until you were finished. Then he said, "She said you blackmailed her." "Yes." "When you were the one who suggested we go to her directly instead of the sheriff." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched the calculation in his face, not anger, which surprised her, but something colder and more deliberate. "Then we let people see what actually happened," he said. "That's what Ruth said." "Ruth's a smart woman." He looked at her. "Are you frightened?" "No," she said. "Then, a little. Not of her. Of what she could make people believe. I know." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same way he had in the garden, like something held carefully. "But here's what I know about you, Evelyn. You walked 22 miles on a broken boot heel to knock on a stranger's door. You found $260 that nobody else was looking for. You made Dill apologize. You made me—" He stopped. He turned her hand over in his. "You made me remember what a house is supposed to feel like." She looked at his hand over hers. "Margaret Collins can say whatever she wants," he said. "This town has known me for 20 years, and they're going to know you. That's not something she can stop." Evelyn looked at him. She thought about the woman who had sat on the edge of a narrow bed 4 weeks after arriving here, and pressed her hands against her thighs, and told herself she was still on her feet, as if that were sufficient. As if surviving were the same thing as living. It wasn't. She knew that now. "Caleb," she said. "Yes." "I need you to understand something." She held his gaze. "Whatever happens with the town, whatever Margaret Collins says, whatever people choose to believe, it is not going to break me. I have been broken by worse and put myself back together. I don't need you to fight for me." He nodded. "But I do need you," she said, "to stand beside me. Not in front. Beside." He looked at her for a moment with that direct, certain look. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly where I intend to be." And Evelyn Harper, who had walked 22 miles to a stranger's door with 14 cents and a worn leather bag and a heart that had learned to expect nothing, pressed her fingers against the hand that was holding hers and thought that this specific moment, this specific man, this specific choice she had made in a bean garden in Montana was worth every hard mile that had brought her to it. She was not safe yet. The rumors were out there. Margaret Collins was not finished. The town had not yet decided what it thought. But for the first time in her life, she was not facing any of it alone. And that changed everything. The rumors moved through clear water, the way fire moves through dry grass, fast, low, and hungry for anything it could reach. By the following Monday, Evelyn heard 3 different versions of the same story. In the first version, she had found the discrepancy in the Collins accounts and gone to Margaret privately threatening to expose her unless Margaret paid not just what was owed, but an additional sum as silence money. In the second version, she had fabricated the discrepancy, entirely manufacturing evidence, to drive Margaret out of Caleb's life because she wanted the ranch for herself. In the third version, the one that hurt the most, because it was the most creative, she had arrived at the ranch already knowing about the accounts sent by a land speculator in Billings, who wanted the eastern section and had planted her specifically to destabilize Caleb's operation from the inside. Pete brought her the third version on a Tuesday morning with the expression of a man delivering something he wishes he didn't have to carry. "I thought you should know what's being said," he told her at the kitchen door. "All of it. Not just the parts that are easy to hear." "Thank you, Pete," she said. "I mean that." He nodded. He turned his hat in his hands. "The boys don't believe it. I want you to know that. Dill said well. Dill said some things that I reckon you don't need me to repeat word for word. But the short version is that anyone who thinks you came here to steal from Mr. Whitaker doesn't know a thing about you or about this ranch." Evelyn looked at him. This young man who'd come up early every morning for 2 months without being asked, who'd started watering the garden as though it were just something he did, who'd brought her the hard news and the easy news with the same honest face. "Tell Dill I said thank you," she said. "And Pete, You come in and have your coffee inside this morning. It's cold." He looked genuinely startled. "Ma'am, come in," she said. "You've been standing at this door for 2 months. Come sit down." He came in. He sat at the kitchen table with both hands around his coffee cup, like he was anchoring himself to the moment, and she made breakfast, and they talked about the bean garden, and the cattle rotation, and whether the winter was going to come early this year, and it was the most ordinary conversation she'd had in weeks, and she needed it more than she'd known. After he left, she went to the office and sat at the desk and thought. She was not going to wait. She had spent enough of her life waiting for things to resolve themselves, for people to come to their senses, for the truth to eventually become visible to everyone who should have been able to see it. The truth didn't travel on its own. It needed someone to carry it. She picked up her pen and started writing. The letter she wrote was not to Margaret Collins. It was to Judge Harmon. 3 pages precise and documented, laying out the timeline of the account's investigation from the moment she'd arrived at the ranch to the moment the final installment was returned. Every entry, every cross-reference, every letter to the billing supplier, every envelope delivered by Margaret's bookkeeper. She included the dates and the amounts and the methodology, and she wrote it in the same clear hand she used for the ledger because she wanted anyone who read it to understand that this was not a woman making accusations. This was a woman presenting a record. She also wrote at the end in plain language that the decision to approach Margaret Collins privately rather than through the sheriff's office had been hers, recommended by her, accepted by Caleb, carried out with the explicit intention of giving Margaret the opportunity to make things right without the matter becoming a public legal proceeding. If that decision now constituted blackmail in the telling of it, she wanted the judge to have the documented truth of what had actually occurred. She signed it. She sealed it. She put it on the desk for Caleb to read before she sent it. He read it that evening after supper, standing at the desk with the pages in his hand. She watched him read it, the way she always watched him read things, completely without rushing. He set it down. "You wrote this today," he said. "This morning." "While I was out in the south pasture?" "Yes." He looked at her. "You didn't wait for me to decide what to do." "No," she said. "I didn't. It's my reputation being discussed, Caleb. I have the right to defend it myself." She paused. "Do you disagree?" I was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't disagree." He looked back at the letter. "It's good. It's thorough." He paused. "You wrote about me too, about what I decided. You protected me in it." "I documented what happened," she said. "That happens to include the fact that you handled it decently." He looked at her with an expression she recognized now, the open, unguarded look, the window on the latch. "Send it," he said. "I'll sign it too if you want." "I think it carries more weight from me alone," she said. "You're right." He nodded. "Send it." She sent it the next morning with Pete, who rode to town and back in 2 hours, and returned with a note from the judge that said simply, "Received. Thank you for the documentation. I'll be in touch." 3 days passed. They were not easy days. In town, the story kept moving. Mrs. Hale had apparently told the Women's Auxiliary that Evelyn Harper had arrived in Clearwater with nothing and had latched on to the richest man in the county because she had nowhere else to go and no one else to take her. The Women's Auxiliary had told their husbands. Their husbands had told each other at the feed store. The feed store had told everyone else. Evelyn went to town on the Wednesday with the regular supply wagon, and she did not change her route, and she did not change her manner. She bought what was on the list. She spoke to everyone who spoke to her. She met every speculative look with a direct one, and every leading question with a clear answer, and she did not apologize for being there. Ruth met her outside the dry goods store and walked with her to the supply barn without being asked, which Evelyn understood to be an act of deliberate public solidarity and was grateful for in a way she didn't entirely know how to express. "The judge received your letter," Ruth said quietly. "I know. He's been asking questions, quietly, about the hardware account, about the timing of everything." She glanced sideways at Evelyn. "He's not the kind of man who lets a documented record sit unexamined." "I know that too," Evelyn said. "That's why I wrote to him." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're not what people expected you to be." What did they expect? Someone who'd fold, Ruth said simply. Someone who'd get quiet and stay quiet and eventually leave. That's what usually happens. When a woman arrives somewhere without connections, and people decide they don't want her. She paused. "You didn't fold." "No," Evelyn said. "I didn't." "Does it get tiring? Staying upright when everyone's pushing?" Evelyn thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "But the alternative is worse." Ruth nodded. "Yes," she said. "It always is." The twist came on a Thursday, and it came from a direction Evelyn hadn't anticipated. She was in the office working through the quarterly supply projections when she heard the wagon coming up the track. Not Pete's usual rhythm, something different, more deliberate. She went to the window and saw a buggy she didn't recognize, drawn by a good horse, driven by a man in a suit that said Helena as clearly as if the city's name had been printed on the lapel. She went to the front door. The man on the porch was somewhere around 50, with the precise, careful air of someone who deals in documents and consequences. He had a leather case under his arm and a card ready when she opened the door. "Thomas Aldrich," he said. "Attorney at law, Helena. I'm looking for Mr. Whitaker." "He's in the south pasture," she said. "I can send someone for him. Would you like to come in?" He came in. She put him in the main room and went to find Pete, and while Pete rode out to fetch Caleb, she made coffee and brought it in and sat across from the attorney and said pleasantly, "What's this regarding Mr. Aldrich?" He looked at her with the professionally neutral expression of a man who has been asked that question in exactly that tone many times before and knows exactly how much to reveal. "Ranch business," he said. "I manage the ranch accounts," she said. "And Mr. Whitaker and I don't keep separate information, so you're welcome to tell me or wait for him. Either way, I'll know before the day is out." He looked at her for a moment. Then he almost smiled. "The estate clause," he said. My former client, I should say, has withdrawn his claim." Evelyn was very still. "The cousin's son," she said. "Gerald Whitaker, yes. He contacted my office this week to withdraw the claim on the eastern section." He set his leather case on his knee. "He's written a letter to Caleb directly. I'm delivering it in person because I wanted to ensure there was no ambiguity about the withdrawal." "Why did he withdraw?" she said. Aldrich paused. He became aware that the clause was being contested on legitimate legal grounds. He also became aware. Another pause, more careful this time, that the reason for the claim's original activation was based on information that wasn't entirely accurate. Evelyn looked at him. What information? Someone had communicated to Gerald Whitaker that Caleb was unlikely to marry or produce an heir given his circumstances, his isolation, his unwillingness to engage with the community. He held her gaze. "It appears that information is out of date." Evelyn set her coffee cup down. "Who communicated it?" she said. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "The letter is for Caleb," he said, not refusing, just redirecting. She heard the front door open, and Caleb came in still in his work clothes, dust on his hat brim. He looked at Aldrich, then at Evelyn, and she could see him reading the room, the quality of the silence, the stillness of her hands, the particular way she was sitting. "Caleb," she said. "This is Thomas Aldrich. He's brought a letter from Gerald Whitaker." Caleb came in and sat down, and Aldrich handed over the letter. Evelyn watched Caleb read it. She watched his face move through 3 different expressions in the space of 2 minutes. Surprise, understanding, and then something that was harder to name, something that settled into his jaw and stayed there. He set the letter down. "He's withdrawing the claim," he said. "Yes," Aldrich said. "Who told him I wasn't going to marry?" Aldrich was quiet. "Mr. Aldrich," Caleb said. His voice was even, controlled. "Who told my cousin's son that this ranch was going to pass to him?" Aldrich looked at the leather case on his knee. "I can only tell you what Gerald Whitaker told me. He said the information came from a contact in Clearwater, a woman who told him approximately 4 months ago that you were a recluse who had closed himself off entirely from any possibility of marriage or family, and that the clause was effectively already triggered." The silence in the room was complete. Evelyn thought about 4 months ago. She had not yet arrived at the ranch 4 months ago, which meant the information had been sent to Gerald Whitaker before she got there, which meant that whoever had been cultivating that claim had been doing it at the same time they were cultivating the hardware account. She looked at Caleb. He looked at her. Neither of them said the name. They didn't need to. "Thank you for coming in person," Caleb said to Aldrich. His voice had not changed. That was the remarkable thing, it had not changed at all. "I appreciate the care you've taken with this. Mr. Whitaker." Aldrich stood. "For what it's worth." Gerald is a young man who was presented with an opportunity he didn't fully understand. He's not a bad person. He simply didn't know enough to see what he was being used for. Caleb nodded once. "I'll keep that in mind." Aldrich left. The room was quiet. Caleb picked up the letter and read it again. Then he set it back down on the table and put both hands flat on it and breathed through his nose. "She contacted my cousin," he said. "Before I ever arrived," Evelyn said. "She was building the claim from the inside, the hardware account that was funding something, or someone." He was quiet. "Caleb." She kept her voice steady because he needed steady right now. "This is documented. The accounts, the timing, the letter, all of it connects. You take this to Judge Harmon with what I already sent him, and it's not rumors anymore. It's a pattern." He looked at her. "She wasn't just stealing from me," he said. "She was trying to take the land. She was trying to manage the outcome," Evelyn said. "She's been trying to manage the outcome of this ranch for years. You, the land, the money, all of it. She just couldn't control for the variable she didn't see coming." "What variable?" "Me," Evelyn said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up. "Get your coat," he said. "Where are we going?" "Town," he said. "We're going to see the judge." They went that afternoon, and what happened in Judge Harmon's office took less than an hour, but had the weight of something much longer. Evelyn laid out the full picture, the hardware account, the delivery shortfalls, the timing of the communication to Gerald Whitaker Aldrich's account of who had provided the information and when. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, because the facts were embellishment enough. The judge listened with his hands folded on his desk and his eyes moving between her and Caleb and the documents she'd brought. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Miss Harper," he said, "you understand that what you're describing, if fully documented and substantiated, constitutes fraud. Not just the account irregularities. Fraud against the estate process. That's a federal matter." "I understand," she said. "You also understand that in making this case you will be examined. Your motives, your history, your reasons for being here. Everything you've told me this afternoon will be questioned by people who have reason to question it." "I understand that too," she said. "And you still want to proceed." "Judge Harmon," she said, "I walked 22 miles to knock on a door because I had nothing left and nowhere to go. I found $260 that had been stolen from the man who gave me work. I wrote you a letter defending my own name because someone was lying about what I'd done. I have been questioned and doubted and talked about since the day I arrived in this county." She looked at him directly. "I am not afraid of being examined. I'm afraid of letting the truth go unspoken because speaking it is uncomfortable." The judge looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "You're a fortunate man," he said. "I know it," Caleb said. The judge opened his drawer. "I'll need copies of everything, and I'll need a statement from Gerald Whitaker's attorney." He began making notes. "This is going to take time, wheels of justice and all that. But I want you to know that the letter you sent me earlier this week, it was thorough. I've been a judge for 18 years, and that letter was one of the clearest presentations of a documented record I've received from a private citizen." He glanced up at her. "Did you study law?" "No," she said. "I kept farm books." "Well," he said, "you're wasted on farm books." Walking out of the courthouse. Caleb stopped on the top step and turned to her. "You brought the documents today," he said. "You had them ready." "I've had them ready since I sent the judge the letter," she said. "I thought it might come to this." "You thought about it before I did." "You were in the south pasture," she said. "I had more time to think." He looked at her with that open, unguarded look. Then he did something he had never done before. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face. A small gesture, simple and careful, like something he'd been thinking about doing for a while and had finally decided to stop thinking about. She went still under his hand. "Evelyn," he said. "Caleb," she said. "I want to ask you something. Properly. Not in a garden, not in a wagon. Here." He kept his eyes on hers. "Will you marry me?" The street was not empty. There were people within earshot. Mrs. Hale was across the road, she was almost certain of it, and Caleb Whitaker was asking her to marry him on the courthouse steps, in plain view of every person in Clearwater who had ever doubted either one of them, and he did not look like a man who cared even slightly who was watching. "You're doing this here," she said. "On purpose." "Yes," he said. "On purpose." She looked at him. This man who had said the wrong thing on a porch and then spent 3 months saying the right things, not because anyone told him to, but because he'd looked at her clearly and seen something worth reaching toward. This man who had stood beside her in a parlor and a courthouse and a garden without ever once standing in front of her. This man who had built a ranch from the ground up and then had the humility to understand that what it was missing wasn't an heir. It was a home. "Yes," she said. He exhaled one long, slow breath, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying for a while, without quite admitting the weight of it. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me," she said. "I'm not doing you a favor, I'm making a choice." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm thanking you." They were married 3 weeks later in the Clearwater church, which was small and not particularly grand. And Evelyn wore the navy dress she'd sewn and carried 3 stems from Clara's herb garden, because it felt right, and Pete stood up beside Caleb, because when Caleb had asked him, Pete had gone red to the ears and said yes before the sentence was fully finished. The town came. Not all of it, and not all of it warmly. Mrs. Hale sat in the back, with an expression that suggested she was reserving judgment indefinitely. But Ruth was there, and Judge Harmon was there, and the ranch hands filled 2 full pews, and Dill, who had not been to church in something close to 4 years, by Pete's estimation, sat in the 3rd row in a clean shirt, with his hat in his lap, and his jaw set, with the same determination he'd worn to the kitchen door the morning he apologized, as if his being there was also an act of will he intended to carry through. When the minister asked Caleb if he took this woman, Caleb said, "I do," in the flat, certain voice he used for everything he was sure about, and Evelyn believed him completely. When the minister asked Evelyn if she took this man, she paused for exactly 1 second, not from doubt, but from the full awareness of what she was saying, the weight and the permanence of it all, the miles and all the doors and all the mornings she'd woken up knowing she could leave and chosen to stay. "I do," she said, and meant every syllable. The reception was held at the ranch, because Caleb had said the ranch was where their life was, and there was no reason to celebrate it somewhere else. And Evelyn had agreed, because the ranch was also where Clara's garden was, and the beans had come fully in by then, green and climbing up the frame Caleb had built, and she wanted her wedding day to include that. She wanted it to include Pete bringing out extra chairs from the bunkhouse, and Dill carrying tables without being asked. And the smell of the kitchen she'd made her own over 3 months of early mornings. She stood at the edge of the garden late in the afternoon, with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, and watched her husband talking to Judge Harmon near the fence, and thought about the woman who had knocked on this door in July with nothing. She was not that woman anymore. Not because she had been changed by love, though love had done its work, patient and thorough and real. But because she had been changed by choice. By the accumulation of mornings she'd gotten up and done the work and held her ground. By every door she hadn't let close her. By the one door she'd knocked on that turned out to be the right one. Ruth appeared beside her. "How do you feel?" she said. "Like I chose well," Evelyn said. "You did," Ruth said. "Both of you." Caleb crossed the yard toward her, then moving through the people and the noise, with the unhurried certainty he brought to everything. And when he reached her, he stood beside her and looked out at the garden and the people and the late afternoon turning everything copper. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Better than I've been in 7 years," he said. She leaned into him slightly. He did not make a thing of it. He simply adjusted the way a man does when someone leans on him and he intends to hold. And if Margaret Collins had walked by at that exact moment and seen them standing there together in the ranch yard, with the garden coming in and the hands raising a toast and the Montana sky going enormous overhead, Evelyn thought she would not have said a word. Some things didn't need defending anymore. They simply were. The morning after the wedding. Evelyn woke before the sun and lay still for a moment, taking stock of the fact that the room felt different. Not the room itself. Same east-facing window, same narrow light beginning at the edge of the curtain. But the quality of the silence was different. Fuller. Like a room that knows it is no longer temporary. She got up and made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window, and watched the ranch wake up the way she had watched it every morning for 3 months, except that this morning it was hers. Not in the way of property, she had no illusions about what her name on a deed meant compared to what her hands on the work meant. But hers in the way that mattered. The way a thing is yours when you have chosen it clearly, and it has chosen you back. Caleb came in at 5:30, hat already on, which meant he'd been out to the barn before she'd heard him move. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her and said, "Morning?" "Morning," she said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He almost smiled. The full version, she'd been watching it come in by degrees for 3 months like a season changing, and this morning it arrived. A real smile, unhurried and unguarded, the kind that reached his eyes and stayed there. She had not seen anything she wanted to hold on to more than that smile in a very long time. "Pete's going to be insufferable today," she said. "He cried at the wedding." "He did not cry," Caleb said. "He absolutely cried. Ruth saw it too." Caleb picked up his coffee cup. "He had something in his eye." "He had a wedding in his eye," Evelyn said. And there it was, laughter at the breakfast table, easy and real, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that simply happens because two people are comfortable enough together that the funny things can be funny without anyone needing to perform them. She had not had that at a breakfast table since her father was alive, and she sat with it for a moment and let it be exactly what it was. The first month of their marriage was not a honeymoon in any catalog sense of the word. There was too much work for that. The fall cattle drive needed organizing, the winter supply order needed finalizing, and Judge Harmon's formal inquiry into the Collins hardware account had begun generating paperwork that required Evelyn's attention at regular intervals. She went into town twice a week to speak with the judge's clerk, and each time she went, she felt the temperature of Clearwater shifting slightly, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that things shift when the facts become undeniable. Mrs. Hale stopped making pointed comments when Evelyn came into the dry goods store. She didn't become warm. Warmth was apparently not in her range with women she'd already decided about, but she stopped performing the pointed comments, which was its own kind of progress. 3 women from the church's sewing circle came to the ranch on a Wednesday, ostensibly to drop off a wedding gift, a quilt beautifully made, which Evelyn received with genuine appreciation, and actually to get a closer look at everything they'd been hearing about for 3 months. She gave them coffee and showed them the kitchen garden and answered their questions directly. And when they left, Ruth told her the following week that 2 of the 3 had come away, saying Evelyn Harper, Evelyn Whitaker, now was not at all what they'd expected. "What did they expect?" Evelyn asked. "Someone harder," Ruth said. "Someone with sharper edges." "I have sharp edges," Evelyn said. "Yes," Ruth said. "But they're on the right places." The inquiry moved forward. In November, 3 months after the wedding, Judge Harmon called Evelyn and Caleb to his office and laid out what the investigation had found. The systematic shortfalls in the Collins hardware deliveries were documented across 22 months. The communication to Gerald Whitaker's attorney, the one that had activated the estate clause, had been traced to a letter sent from Clearwater, handwritten unsigned, but matched by the judge's investigators, to Margaret Collins's correspondence style through comparison with other documents she'd filed in county records over the years. It was not a perfect legal case. It was, the judge said, sufficient for a formal charge. Caleb sat across from the judge with his hands on his knees and his face very still. "What do you want to do?" the judge asked him. Caleb looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. She did not tell him what to think. She waited. "I want her to admit it," Caleb said. "In front of someone who matters. Not a courtroom, I don't want a trial. But I want her to sit down in front of a witness and say what she did and why she did it." The judge nodded slowly. "I can arrange that. A formal statement witnessed and notarized in lieu of prosecution, if she makes a full accounting and agrees to the terms." "Those are my terms," Caleb said. He looked at Evelyn again after he said it. She nodded once. The meeting with Margaret Collins happened on a Friday morning in November in the judge's office, with Evelyn and Caleb on one side of the table and Margaret on the other, and the judge at the end. Margaret came in with her composure assembled piece by piece like armor put on in a hurry, most of it in place, but the joints showing. She sat down. She looked at Caleb. She did not look at Evelyn. "You don't need to explain your reasons," Caleb said. "I'm not here to understand you. I'm here for the statement." Margaret looked at her hands. "I communicated to Gerald Whitaker's attorney that you were unlikely to marry. I told him the clause was effectively triggered." She stopped. "I had convinced myself that the ranch was that I would eventually be the one to manage it. With you. That in time you would—" She stopped again. "I was wrong about that. I understand that now." "The hardware account," the judge said quietly. "The shortfalls were intentional," she said. "I told myself it was a loan, that I'd repay it when the business stabilized." She looked up at Caleb for the first time. "I told myself a great many things that weren't true. I think you know something about that." The room was very quiet. "I do," Caleb said. "The difference is, I stopped." Margaret looked down at her hands again. "Yes," she said. "I suppose that is the difference." She signed the statement. She stood. She picked up her coat, and then she paused and looked for the first and only time in that room directly at Evelyn. "You're going to be fine," she said. Her voice was stripped of everything it usually carried. Just the words. "This ranch. With him. You're going to be fine." It was the only honest thing Margaret Collins had said to her since the first day she'd appeared in that doorway, with her prepared expression and her perfect smile. "I know," Evelyn said. "Thank you." Margaret left. Caleb and Evelyn walked out of the courthouse into the November cold and stood on the steps where 2 months ago he had asked her to marry him in plain view of the whole town. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. He took her hand. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Winter came to Montana with the particular commitment of a force that has been doing the same thing for 10,000 years and sees no reason to apologize about it. The ranch settled into winter rhythms, shorter days, longer evenings. The crew rotating through barn duties and fence checking in a pattern Evelyn had helped organize before the first frost hit. She had put the kitchen garden to bed properly, covering what needed covering, harvesting what could be brought in, letting the rest return to the ground. The beans had given them more than she'd expected. She'd put up 27 jars of preserves, which Pete had regarded with the reverence of a man in the presence of something sacred. The evenings were her favorite part of winter, after supper. After the crew had gone back to the bunkhouse, and the dishes were done, she and Caleb sat in the main room with the fire going and the lamps lit and talked. About the ranch, about the supply contracts, about Ruth's plan to start a lending library out of the schoolroom, and whether Evelyn could spare some books from the ones she'd accumulated on the shelves. About smaller things. Pete's increasing interest in the cattle rotation schedule, which suggested he was thinking about a future in ranch management rather than just ranch work. About Dill's quietly improved disposition and whether it was permanent. About Clara sometimes. Caleb talked about Clara the way you talk about someone when the grief has settled into something you've made room for, not without weight, but without the breath-catching quality of fresh loss. He talked about the way she'd laugh at things he said that weren't intended to be funny and somehow made them funny by laughing. About the argument they'd had about the east fence line that she'd been absolutely right about. About the fact that she had wanted children and they hadn't come, and how they had both carried that quietly without letting it become a wedge between them. "She would have liked you," he said one evening. "You think so?" Evelyn said. "She would have liked the way you handle the books," he said. "She would have liked the way you handle Dill." He paused. "She would have liked the way you handle me." Evelyn looked at him across the fire. "How do I handle you?" "Like I'm a person," he said, "rather than a problem or an asset." She was quiet for a moment. "Was that rare?" "Yes," he said. "It was." She thought about that. About the man who had opened his door in July and offered a roof in exchange for a son who had been alone long enough that he'd started thinking of human beings as solutions to practical problems. About how far he'd come from that, and how quietly, and how much of it had been his own choosing. "Caleb," she said. "Evelyn. I'm glad I knocked on your door." He looked at her for a moment. "So am I," he said. "Every day I'm glad." It was in January that the twist came. The one she had not seen coming, had not prepared for, had not allowed herself to imagine, because imagining it felt like tempting something she had no right to hope for. She had not been feeling well for 2 weeks. Not ill exactly, nothing specific enough to name, nothing that stopped her working. Just a particular tiredness that sat in her bones differently from ordinary tiredness, and a morning nausea that she had been attributing to the cold and the change of season, and the fact that she had been pushing herself harder than usual, getting the winter accounts in order. It was Ruth who said it first. She came to the ranch on a Tuesday with a book she'd borrowed and stayed for coffee, and she looked at Evelyn across the kitchen table with those clear, direct eyes and said, "How long have you been feeling like this?" "Like what?" Evelyn said. "Like everything requires more effort than it should. Like mornings are harder than they used to be." Evelyn looked at her. "Evelyn," Ruth said quietly. "When did you last—" She stopped. Said it with her eyes instead. The kitchen was very still. "I haven't." Evelyn started. Stopped. Counted backward in her head, which she had not allowed herself to do, because allowing herself to do it felt like opening a door. She wasn't sure she had the right to open. She counted. She counted again. Her hands went flat on the table. "Oh," she said. Ruth reached across and covered her hands with both of hers. "When you're ready to know for certain," she said, "the doctor in Clearwater is a good man. He's discreet." Evelyn looked at their hands on the table. She thought about the porch. About, "I need a wife who can give me a son." She thought about standing in the garden and asking Caleb the question that had been living in her chest since the beginning. "If I could never give you a child, would you still choose me?" And the flat, certain yes that had come back without hesitation. She had believed him. She still believed him. But she had also believed quietly in the privacy of her own heart that the question was academic. That the answer would never matter because the condition would never arise. That she was 30 years old and had never, and that was simply the shape of her life, and she had made her peace with it. She had apparently made her peace too soon. She saw the doctor on a Thursday. How was a quiet man named Fielding, who had been practicing in Clearwater for 15 years, and who confirmed what she already knew in the place beneath her ribs, where you know things before you're ready to know them, and who told her she was in good health, and the pregnancy appeared to be proceeding normally, and she should come back in 6 weeks. She drove herself home. She sat in the wagon in front of the ranch house for 5 minutes before she got down. She went inside. Caleb was in the office going through the spring cattle projections. He looked up when she came in, and something in her face made him put the papers down immediately. "What happened?" he said. "Are you all right?" She stood in the doorway of the office where she had spent hundreds of hours over the past 6 months turning chaos into order, where she had written the letter to the judge and documented $263.40, and built the case that had protected this ranch and this man from a woman who had been trying to take both. She looked at him. "I'm going to have a child," she said. The silence that followed was the longest 3 seconds she had ever lived through. Then Caleb stood up from the desk so fast the papers went sideways, and he crossed the office in 4 steps and stopped in front of her and put both hands on her face. Careful, like she was something he was afraid of startling, and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the almost smile. Not the steady storm-colored certainty. Something entirely different. Something that looked like a man who has just been handed something he had stopped believing he was allowed to want. "Are you sure?" he said. "The doctor confirmed it this afternoon," she said. His hands were still on her face. She could feel them shaking slightly, barely just at the edges. the tremor of someone holding something very still, because they don't trust themselves not to grip too hard. "Evelyn," he said. Her name and his voice in this moment sounded like something it had never sounded like before. Like a prayer that had finally found the right address. "I know," she said. "I know. I told you." He stopped. "On the day you asked me, I told you it didn't matter, and it didn't. It doesn't. I need you to know that what I'm feeling right now is not because you've given me what I asked for that first day on the porch." He shook his head. That man on the porch didn't know what he needed. "You've been showing me what I needed for 6 months. This—" He stopped again. His voice had gone rough. "This is not the reason I love you." She put her hands over his. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not afraid to tell you." He pulled her in and held her, and she let herself be held. Really held, the way you let yourself be held when you trust the arms completely. And she stood in the office of the ranch. She had walked 22 miles to reach and thought about all the things that had to go exactly as they'd gone to bring her to this moment. The cousins with the broom closet. The teacher at the social. The landlord and his furniture. The 14 cents. The scrap of paper with a name on it worn thin at the crease. Every hard mile had been exactly the right mile. She had known that, but now she felt it. The news moved through the ranch, the way news always moved. Pete found out by noticing that Caleb was smiling at the south pasture fence for no structural reason, and Pete told the crew, and the crew responded with the collective relief of people who have been rooting for something for a long time and are finally allowed to show it. Dill appeared at the kitchen door with his hat in his hands and said, "Heard the news, ma'am. That's well." He put his hat back on. "That's real good news." And went back out, which was more than she'd expected, and exactly the right amount. Ruth came on Saturday with preserves she didn't need to bring, and sat across from Evelyn at the kitchen table with shining eyes and said, I knew it before you did." "You suspected," Evelyn said. "I knew," Ruth said. "Some things you just know." Evelyn looked at her. "Are you happy for me, or are you happy for the story?" Ruth laughed the real kind. "Both," she said. "Absolutely both. Is that all right?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "It is." The hardest conversation was the one she didn't expect to be hard. It was February deep winter, and she was in the garden not working, it just standing at the edge of it, the way she sometimes did. Looking at the covered beds and thinking about spring. She heard Caleb come up behind her, and she didn't turn, and they stood there together for a moment in the cold. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me," she said. Clara wanted a garden, he said. She wanted children. She wanted this ranch to feel like a home and not just a property. He was quiet for a moment. "She didn't get any of those things, not fully. And I've been carrying that. The feeling that I failed her, that I built everything she asked for, and she didn't get to have it." Evelyn turned to look at him. "And now," he said, "everything she wanted is here. The garden, the child coming, the house feeling the way it feels." He met her eyes. "And I don't know how to hold both things at once, being grateful for what I have now and still being sorry for what she didn't get." She looked at him for a long moment. "You hold them the same way," she said. "At the same time. You don't have to choose between grief and gratitude. They're not opposites." She paused. "Clara loved this ranch because she loved what it meant to you. What it means now, what it's become. I think she'd consider that a completion, not a replacement." He was quiet. "You think so," he said. "I think a woman who wanted a kitchen garden and a home full of life would look at what this place is now and feel nothing but glad," Evelyn said. "I think love that's real doesn't stop when the person does. It goes into the ground like seed. It comes up in the people who come after." He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached out and took her hand, the familiar gesture careful, like something held because it matters. "How do you know things like that?" he said. "I had a good father," she said, "and a hard road. Both of them teach you." Spring came, the way. It always came to Montana, not gently, but decisively, as though the land had simply concluded that winter had gone on long enough, and it was time to get back to the business of growing things. The beans went back in. The herb beds were turned and replanted. Pete, who had apparently developed opinions about kitchen gardens over the winter, showed up one morning with seeds he'd ordered from a catalog in Billings, and a plan for expanding the beds along the south fence that was actually quite good, and Evelyn approved it on the spot, which left him looking pleased with himself for the rest of the day. The town had changed too. Not entirely, towns don't change entirely, they just shift like ice in a river when the thaw comes. But something had moved in Clearwater's understanding of who Evelyn Whitaker was, and what the Whitaker Ranch was, and what the story of that woman who had walked 22 miles to knock on a stranger's door actually amounted to. Judge Harmon told her in March that the formal inquiry into the Collins matter had concluded. Margaret Collins had paid an additional sum in penalties, agreed to a set of business restrictions, and had from all accounts substantially reduced her social activities in Clearwater. She had not left town, which Evelyn had not expected her to. A woman like Margaret Collins did not leave. She receded. She became smaller without becoming absent, which was perhaps its own kind of consequence. Evelyn did not feel triumph about it. She felt something quieter, the particular satisfaction of a record set, straight a thing documented and resolved the ledger balanced. That was all she'd ever wanted. The baby came in August. It was a long labor, and an honest one, no worse than she'd been told to expect, no better either, and Ruth was there, which helped more than Evelyn had anticipated, and Caleb was in the next room, which helped more than she would have admitted. She could hear him pacing. She had never heard him pace before in her life, and she found between contractions that it made her want to laugh. "He's wearing through the floor," Ruth said, tilting her head toward the sound. "He'll stop when it's over," Evelyn said. "Or he'll pace right through to the basement," Ruth said. She did laugh at that, which was exactly what Ruth had intended. The baby was a girl. She arrived in the early morning with her father's dark hair and her mother's stubborn set to the jaw and a pair of lungs that announced themselves with an authority that made Ruth say, "Oh, she's going to be trouble," with the tone of a woman who means it as the highest possible compliment. Caleb came in when Ruth called him, and he stood at the edge of the bed and looked at the child in Evelyn's arms with an expression she had never seen on him and would never forget, stripped entirely of the controlled, careful distance he wore through the world. Open. Undone. The face of a man who has had something break open in him that he hadn't known needed breaking. "A girl," he said. "A girl," Evelyn said. He sat down on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle her, and he looked at the baby, and he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "She looks like she knows something." "She just arrived," Evelyn said. "She doesn't know anything yet." "I don't know," he said. "She looks like she's already decided how things are going to go." Evelyn looked at her daughter, at the small, fierce, decided face, and thought that he was probably right. "What do you want to call her?" she said. Howe was quiet for a moment. She knew what he was considering. She waited. "Clara," he said. "If you—" He stopped. "If that's all right with you." Evelyn looked at him. "It's a good name," she said. "It's the right name." He nodded. He reached out and touched the baby's hand, one finger careful, and little Clara Whitaker closed her fist around it with the absolute confidence of someone who has decided this is hers and sees no reason to negotiate about it. Caleb looked at his daughter's hand around his finger, and Evelyn watched his face, and she saw the exact moment the last piece of something long broken finished mending itself. "Hello," he said quietly to the baby. "I'm your father." Clara regarded him with dark, serious eyes and maintained her grip. "She's not going to let go," Ruth said from the doorway, smiling. "No," Caleb said. "I don't expect she is." He looked up at Evelyn then, and everything they had been to each other, employer and employee, skeptic and proof. Two people who had been taught by hard experience not to trust. Choosing trust anyway, all of it was in that look, distilled and clear. "Thank you," he said. "You keep thanking me," she said. "I keep telling you I'm not doing you a favor." "I know," he said. "I'm thanking you for choosing it, all of it, for walking through that gate when you had every reason not to." She looked at her daughter, at her husband, at the room that had been a stranger's house 6 months ago and was now so thoroughly hers that she could not remember the shape of herself before it. She thought about the woman who had slammed a boarding house door in Clearwater with 14 cents in her pocket and 22 miles of Montana dust ahead of her, and one name on a worn scrap of paper. She thought about what that woman had believed, that she was too much of some things and not enough of others, that the world had measured her and found her wanting, that the best she could do was keep walking and keep her back straight and not let them see the cracking. That woman had been wrong. Not because the world had been wrong about her, though it had been completely and without excuse, but because she had been wrong about herself, wrong about what she deserved, wrong about what was possible, wrong about whether a door could open into something she hadn't been able to imagine yet. She had knocked on the right door, and the door had opened. "Evelyn," Caleb said. "I know," she said. "I'm all right." "You're more than all right," he said. She looked at her daughter, at Clara, who was still holding her father's finger with the grip of someone who has decided the world is worth holding on to, and she thought that this was the thing she had been walking toward without knowing it. Not rescue, not settlement, not the relief of having finally run far enough to find shelter. This, a kitchen that smelled like coffee and fresh bread, a garden coming in along the south fence, a husband who had learned to say her name like it meant something, a daughter with her jaw and his eyes already decided about the world. A home. Not the home she had been given. Not the home she had been promised and had taken away. Not the home she had settled for because she ran out of road. The home she had chosen with clear eyes and steady hands on a morning in July when she had 14 cents and a worn leather bag and enough spine left to knock on one more door. Some women are told from the time they are small that they are too much, too large, too loud, too particular, too unwilling to diminish themselves for the comfort of rooms that were not built for them. They are told this so many times by so many voices that they begin to believe the problem is themselves. They learn to apologize for the space they take up. They learn to need less. They learn to walk away and call the walking strength when sometimes the strength is in the staying. Evelyn Harper had walked away from everything that couldn't hold her, and then she had walked toward the one thing that could, and she had stayed. That was the whole of it. That was the truth of Evelyn Whitaker née Harper, who had arrived at a ranch in Montana with nothing and had built everything. Not because a man had given it to her, not because luck had finally turned, but because she had known what she was worth when no one else did, and she had refused mile after mile and door after door to accept less. She had been rejected by everyone, and she had found in the end that rejection is not a verdict. It is only a door that wasn't the right one. The right door was always the next one, and she had knocked on it, and it had opened, and she had walked through.